There is something I wanted to talk about that's kind of political, and I wanted to see if any of you had some opinions on it. Has anyone been following this whole trucker thing? What do they call it? The convoy? I'm interested to see what all of you think about it. In Canada, that's the one, yeah, in Canada. When he says yes, and I think it's great. The truckers with the Confederate and Nazi flags on their trucks, says Dorva Lama. I feel like immediately I've got exactly what I was looking for, right? So we live in a very polarized time, and now more than ever I feel like I'm an air quotes centrist or whatever, but it seems like increasingly the problem is the reporting or the narrative just seems to emerge when a story happens. It gets narrativized almost immediately. Anna the snowboarder says, I hear about it almost every time I watch the news. In what context do they talk about it, right? As I understand it, some Canadians have adopted the same views of Americans budding fascists. So right, okay, two people are referred to fascism because of truckers. You know, they're doing this convoy, and they're doing it to protest against mandates in the name of people having autonomy and freedom over their own bodies and whatnot, is the idea. No, they don't have any Confederate flags in Canada. That is misinformation. It's misinformation that sort of sounds like it when you think about it. Like, why would they be flying Confederate flags? That's an American thing. Vaccine mandates are also marching with Nazis here in Austria and compare themselves to the Jews during the Third Reich. They keep destroying property and police cars. I don't know much about that, but I will tell you what I do know about. By being pushed into a more centrist way of looking at things, at being sort of disenfranchised by my own, coming from more of a left-leaning background, sort of becoming disconnected from how I saw things reported on that side. And just once you disconnect from one of the sides, you just see how events happen, and immediately it's like things are narrativized. So the moment I start hearing about this stuff, I'm immediately rather skeptical, because depending on which places I go to, and I have several places I can go to get like different sorts of opinions, the story's different in each place. It's like kind of bizarre. And what I see is a lot of like flip-flopping from the different ideologies, where because everyone online seems to want to score like, the slam dunk on the other side, everyone's rallying out these so-called logical statements of this thing and the other, and there's so much happening in the world all the time that you can kind of take the political event and then just apply it to something similar that's happened, and then you see a sort of hypocrisy, because everyone... I heard this thing a while ago that just seems so prevalent now. Everyone wants to sound logical and reasonable, and like we're actually making good use of logic and reason, but it tends to be that you have your emotional reaction to something based on your bias or your political leaning, and then logic and reason come after the fact. They become the tools you use to support your view. It should be the other way around. Logic and reasoning should come first before you have a viewpoint. I don't know how to achieve that myself, but I try not to have strong views on anything because of realizing that's so apparent. This trucker thing that I've heard about, I've seen the statements the organization themselves have put out, and everything they're saying to me is entirely reasonable, that they're peaceful, and the things that they stand for, the way they're doing it, it all sounds decent to me. I haven't done a deep dive. I don't know if there's more to it than that. If there's an organization and a movement, you gotta at some point take what they say at face value to some extent. And then what happens is how it's being reported falls into left and right. So when I go into left-leaning places like Reddit, the way it's being talked about feels utterly alien from what's being described, right? And I'm hearing these stories of property damage, violence taking place in the name of these truckers, and it's just so different from if you go to a different place to learn about it. When he says, yes, it's just normal hard-working people standing up for freedom, that's at the end of the day my takeaway is it feels more like that. But like many things, they become politicized, and then they become left and right, and then where the truth is and isn't and whatnot, I just don't know. But here's the big takeaway for me: to point out the hypocrisy, and not to try and paint hypocrisy like it's some golden bullet, but just like, we're all fallible. It's okay. We've got to take responsibility for our own mistakes, and the hypocrisy is everywhere. Some time ago, I got exposed to one of those ideas in George Orwell's 1984 book, called doublethink, the ability to hold opposing views at the same time, views that contradict one another. And I took that and I thought, that's really interesting, that. And I sort of took it seriously. And then occasionally I would spot myself having like strong views on something, and then actually, wait a minute, I also believe this other thing as well, and they do kind of contradict each other. You got to look for it in yourself, and then maybe you'll see it in the world as well, these contradictions. So what I'm talking about is how protest is conveyed in the media and how it is always seemingly skewed to the political point. So we have seen like a fair few protest movements over recent years, and the reaction from either side on the political aisle is to argue all the points against it, to point out that in protests that you have violence, you have rioting, you have looting. And it's always about aligning it with your own political agenda. It doesn't seem to be a value, like you're standing on a value. You're just using whatever logic and reasoning happens to line up with the current events. So if you are like on the left side, let's say, which it seems to be currently would mean that you're looking at this movement unfavorably, it's been painted as being the bad thing if you're on the left. In those communities, we're seeing reports and talk of violence, and a couple of people pointed out Nazism and Confederate flags and all of this stuff. There's that on the left. And then if you were to take something like the Black Lives Movement from last year, which was a pro-left movement, there was violence, there was rioting and destruction of property, and yet the political stance was to downplay those things and to upplay the point. And I'm not trying to comment on the movements themselves being wrong or right, but it's how the narrative gets flipped. The same thing happened with the January the 6th insurrection, that, for a lot of people that went there on that day, they didn't actually participate in the horrible scenes that we saw when people went into the government building. That's a smaller group. Because these things are politicized, it's hard to talk in actual numbers. But the point being, in both the Black Lives Matter movement and on January the 6th, there was destruction of property and there was rioting or the equivalent of. But there were also people there who were doing things peacefully and being of, goodwill or good intent. And it's almost like, everyone will come out with the arguments to defend their side rather than looking at it and seeing that it pretty much every time you have a movement and a protest and people gathering, there's always a small crowd that cause trouble. I imagine with the truckers there will be a small crowd that cause trouble. And the leaders of the trucker movement sort of very clearly stated that they're well and truly against that and are not encouraging it. Yet that seems to be the focus. You're against that movement, and then you focus on all of that and make it out like that's the whole thing. And the same thing was flipped with the Black Lives Matter movement from left to right, that people on the right would talk about all the violence and the rioting and not the issue itself, and then on the left it would be talking about the issue itself and downplaying the violence. Like I think when people come out and protest, they have a genuine reason, and most of the time those genuine reasons need to be listened to. And yes, there's always going to be people who turn up and cause trouble, but the way things are discussed politically just means it's never treated equally, and it's the worst of the situation is played up to your political side. Here it is unfolding again, another one. There's always going to be something round the corner, right? These truckers are coming out, they're protesting against mandates, which they should have the right to do. People should have the right to protest. If you agree with them or disagree with them, that's part of living in a democracy. And a quote I heard a while ago that got stuck in my head, that like living in a democracy is being perpetually annoyed. There will be people who have different opinions to you. That is part of being in a democratic society, that we're supposed to get along together and tolerate one another when we have differences of opinions on these things. But that seems to be evaporating with this increasing polarization. It's just madness. It's like, where does this end? I don't know where all of this ends. I'm keeping that quote, says Little Ham. It's a great one, right? It's a great one. It says so much about what democracy is. This is why it's important that you have independent news agencies, not two corporate identities who own like 95% of the outlets. Yeah, I'd agree with that. And also we're living in a time where news itself has got bad incentives. Outrage gets more clicks. So, there's an incentive to find the way to make it the most worst and clickable thing we can, right? I think a lot of what is going on is because people forget to respect others if they're different, says Mum Divine. Yeah, we need to respect one another. I took my vaccine. I'll take booster shots. There's this quote that goes around called, trust the science, and I've heard it criticised recently. And I actually thought I understand this criticism, and it's quite potent because trust the science doesn't teach you the science. It doesn't give you the tools or the understanding. And a lot of the authoritative figures have spoken with a lot of certainty where science is, in a way, is an uncertain process at times. They need to talk with the language of, like, here is what we recommend currently based on the latest available data, and it's not often communicated that way, and that doesn't educate people and can sow a lot of mistrust. I think our institutions do need to do a better job, but having an active interest in science and a curiosity for learning about it, none of this vaccine stuff scares me because I've learned so much about it before it became a current thing and became politicized. And I think it's okay for people to be worried or skeptical. Not everyone's a scientist, and someone's going to inject you with something in your arm in a scary moment in history. Like, I think we need more leeway for people to be able to feel skeptical, but like the answer isn't mandates in my mind. It's not forcing people. It's education and teaching and trying to communicate. Yeah, I'm just worried that like we're just going in the complete wrong direction. So, of what I know of this trucker movement, I support. I'm not for mandates at all. However, I will be first in line to take the vaccine, right? And I do that because I've had an active and curious interest in learning about virology, the immune system, and vaccines and all these things for some time, for years. Before the pandemic, I was learning about it, and so I'm not afraid or scared of it, and I understand how it's done. But that isn't communicated by the authorities. The authorities speak with a certainty, and I think it would be humbling for them to point out that science is a process and that the data changes and actions and decisions are made with the best of intentions based on what's available at the time. And with a lack of that, it's no surprise there's so much chaos around all of this. Politicians are the worst at explaining science, says Manu CL. They are, and here on YouTube we have lots of science communicators who do a fantastic job with it. When he says, I am not anti-vax, I am anti-mandate, I am with X, educate but don't force. Yeah, and another thing that's really concerning to me, I think it was the Australian Prime Minister came out saying that, like, if you're anti-mandate, you're anti-vax. This way of speaking, like, really worries me because there is a distinction there. Why are you ruling out this distinction? There's a clear distinction. They are not the same thing. And it doesn't look good. It's polarizing. It makes you look distrustful, I think. It's really worrying that things are playing out this way. I think a lot of people are afraid of what the future holds after taking the vaccine. The science won't tell you how your body will react to it years down the road, if it will give cancer, etc. I think a ton of people share this for a reason opt not to get to the vaccine, says Iris Built. Yeah, so yeah, that's probably a very common concern, and there is a scientific answer for that. And again, this is about the communication, like education over telling people, no, the authorities are like, no, take the vaccine, it's okay. The reasoning why is because there is a history of vaccinations dating back over 100 years. We have been using vaccines in society for a long, long time. And historically, as I've heard it, the evidence is, or shows, for all the other vaccines we've used, side effects appear within days, weeks, months at the most. With our history of vaccines, there aren't any where, like, years down the road we have these problems because of them. And so that's a strong reason for why we can take these vaccines now and not worry about long-term side effects. If there are side effects, they turn up relatively soon. I got the vaccines last year and my booster shot last year as well. If I were to have any side effects, that window has gone now. So I'm good for it, basically. Correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't the COVID vaccine unlike any other vaccine used before? Cesaris built. Yeah, so this one uses a different method. I believe it has been partially used and developed and tested. It's not entirely new. It has a history of development. Like, it's almost like, you know, there's another way of looking at this stuff. You can be skeptical. The miraculousness of the mRNA vaccine is that if we didn't have that technology, we might be in a very different situation right now. I don't know if there's any cause for concern around it being a new method or whatnot, but this is where I defer to trust in institutions more than be skeptical. Like, I'm not a scientist. I can't see how thousands and thousands of scientists working together around the globe to respond to a terrible situation to give us something to fight back with. I can't see how there would be, you know, mass complacency or ignorance there. It just, there's a lot of efficacy and trials and, I don't know, laws, you know, whatever. The whole structure is set up to do this stuff right. But yeah, you know, it is new and novel, but I'm sure they understand far more about immunology than you or I would, and that if this stuff has been okayed, I'm happy to trust them on that. These guys definitely don't get enough credit. Without them working behind the scenes, creating vaccines and cures, it's incredible. Thanks for the reply. Always love to hear your opinion on some things, X. Thanks for joining in the conversation, my dude. Again, like, this is something I want to encourage all of you to do. Like, being in the edutainment space on YouTube gives you a window into what actually happens behind the scenes. Like, Crash Course did an absolutely great series of videos on pandemics and vaccines. That's a really good place to get, like, scientific information. You know, getting to peer behind the scenes just, you know, on one level reminds you of how little you know, and on another just, like, fascinates me as to how complex some of this stuff is and how hard people work to make it all happen. The chances of the vaccine being dangerous are incredibly low, but it's always good to be cautious. We don't know what we don't know, after all, says Juiced. Yes. Yeah, there's always that. You don't know what you don't know. I have a friend use the argument they developed it too fast, it can't be trusted yet. My argument was, medical has advanced leaps and bounds since something like the polio outbreaks we used to have. Yeah, you know what I would say to that kind of thing is, maybe ask that person to elaborate on the process. You know, go deep on the process. You know, where does it start? Who approves what? What kind of research is done? How the paper's shared? Shine a light on how little you actually know about this stuff first can be helpful, I think, because, you know, we can think in terms of, oh, maybe it's too fast, but then, well, what if you were in charge of doing that? You know absolutely nothing. Like, the public, on some level, know absolutely nothing about this stuff, right? Carl says, if you actually look into mRNA technology development, you will learn it has been developed since 50 years ago. We were so lucky we had the knowledge when the pandemic hit. Yeah, it's been developed over a long time. I haven't heard 50 years before, but I was aware of it being a thing that we're on the cusp of doing. One of the reasons it wasn't done sooner, though, is because there is, you know, a financial element tied up in all of this. And when there's an outbreak, there's a need for something. When the outbreak goes away, the need goes away and the funding dries up. So, like, where there had been previous SARS outbreaks here and there that didn't amount to a global pandemic, there was an initial need for these things, so the development and research starts on those, and then those needs go away, and unfortunately it stops. You've made it to the end of the video, so if you'd like to keep listening to my thoughts and opinions, then YouTube reckons that you might like one of these videos, so have a look at the screen, give one of them a click, and thanks for watching.